Thank you, Michael, for this introduction. Very famous story about President Johnson, who was also introduced in a beautiful way. And he said afterwards, "My father liked it and my mother would have believed it." I want to thank also Catherine Aaron Beller for making this possible, and obviously the shul here. Very, very quickly, outside there is a possibility to fill in your name and your email address so that you can receive free of any charge every week my thoughts to ponder, as they are called, machshavot, which will come to you on Thursday. Secondly, there are many booklets and essays laying outside which you can just take, and also a tefillah which I wrote for the shalom of the world. As you just heard, I have to leave quite in time tonight because I have a Chatunah in my family which I didn't know of at the time when we made up for this shiur. So forgive me for that. In case you have questions and I have no chance to answer, write to me. There's emails lying outside and I will definitely respond to you. What I have to say tonight is highly unusual, no doubt controversial. This whole Hartza'ah stands in scaffoldings. It requires much more thought and much more work. It is terribly disturbing, and the whole purpose, in according to my opinion, of the Jewish tradition is to disturb. Halakha is there to disturb, not to make us feel good or not to feel and make us comfortable. As you could see in the title of the lecture, the point of departure is that God and the Torah are both big disappointments. They're both morally problematic. They seem to violate moral principles, but, and this is important, God does exist, whatever that means. And I definitely believe that the Torah is min hashamayim, is from heaven. And that is not a contradiction in terms. Our series here is called Mul Pnei Haroa, confronting the evil. And the questions which I indeed will respond to is the question about, is God really good? And secondly, is the Torah really moral? And I want to start with, first of all, some challenges concerning the Torah. You will later understand why I do it that way. We all know quite well, and let's be quite honest about it, there are mitzvot in the Torah which are morally highly problematic. Take the case of the Agunah, the woman who can't get married because she is still married to her first husband, who, for example, refuses to give her a get. And even when we find a way to force the husband to do so, which is possible, the issue really is that a woman is not capable of ever giving a get to her husband. And that's purely unfair. Another example is that a mamzer, a child out of a very specific relationship between a religious, or better, between a married woman and an other person to whom she is not married, the children are mamzerim. I suppose I do not have to explain what that is. And you also know that in case a mamzer marries even somebody who he or she is allowed to marry to, the children are again mamzerim. And this goes on infinitely forever afterwards. Nobody can tell us that is morally possible to explain in the conventional ways. In general, if you look in the Torah, there is something of the discrimination of the woman. It is a very much a patriarchal institution. The men are playing the big role here, the women are on the side. And all these matters, obviously, are at this moment deeply discussed within Jewish philosophy by religious and by non-religious philosophers. And it brings the Torah in disrepute. it gives it a bad name. And still, as religious Jews, like myself, I believe that the Torah is min hashamayim, is from heaven. I do not want to go into what that exactly means. There are many different possibilities of explaining this, but as such, we understand it to be a divine text, which was a long time ago given to us. On the other side, we also know that there are beautiful things in the Torah of the highest moral levels, and also highly ethical. Just take the case of Shabbat, which is a highly ethical concept. Taharat HaMishpacha is also one of them, and there are many more of them, and it seems that if you look in the Torah, there's a lot of tension between what we would call great mitzvot, which we all love and like, on one side, and these disturbing mitzvot on the other side, and this is all in one and the same text, spoken by the one and the same God. Highly problematic. It is for that reason, again, no time to go into this now, that there are opinions outside the Dati, or let's say Orthodox community, who would claim that the Torah is therefore not completely min hashamayim. I'm sure you all have heard about Bikorat HaTanakh, Bible critique, Bible criticism, which has a long history on itself, and that therefore some also denominations are of the opinion that we can do away with something like the Mamzer and the Aguna because it doesn't belong there and God never said these words. But that's definitely not the Orthodox perspective, and I'm going tonight to speak about how to look to this from an Orthodox perspective. That doesn't mean to say that there's a lot to say for what the others have to say, but I want to show you a way how even from an Orthodox perspective we can actually deal with this. Anyway, to do so, we also have to realize, obviously, that what the rabbis have done, and I come later back to that, when we have these moral problems, if you look in the Talmud, and I wrote in great lengths about it, and it's lying over there in English and in Hebrew, if you want to take that home, the rabbis have tried all sorts of different ways to get out of these moral problems. Sometimes they look far-fetched in the way how the argument goes in the Talmud, just to make sure that on the end the woman is not an aguna, or this young man or this young woman is not a mamzer. And when you look to that, you like the idea, obviously, because at least they found a way out. But if you look to the argument behind it, how they did that, then you have a big question mark. How does that work? Are we not being fooled by the sages for doing so? My answer is no, not at all. And you will have to read more about it, and I will only go a little bit into this tonight. You will see actually that it makes a lot of sense if you understand the nature of the Torah and what this Torah really wants to achieve. But before I go on, I want to take now these problems and add other problems to it, and that is God himself, the evil which he creates or he allows. And you know, there is in philosophy a concept which is called theodicy, which is the justification of God, trying to justify God for the terrible things which happen in this world. Not so much the things which we did to ourselves, but first of all things like earthquakes, terrible other kinds of disasters, illnesses, suffering, including little small babies and so on, where you start to wonder, how does a good God ever do something like that? These are fundamental questions which go back for thousands of years in Jewish philosophy, also in non-Jewish philosophy, by the way, in all sorts of different ways. These are the two problems. The moral problem, as far as the Torah is concerned, and the problem of God concerning his morality. Let me show you an interesting Gemara, which to me, when I for the first time saw this, I was absolutely taken by this. I come from a completely secular background. My father was a Spinozist. I was raised in a Spinoza tradition. I've written a lot about Spinoza. And when you then start to confront yourself with the Jewish tradition, you suddenly see a totally different world, which sometimes doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I remember very clearly that I thought at the time that the Talmudical sages were crazy. till later on in life I realized that there is much more on which Spinoza never spoke about, and perhaps deliberately didn't want to speak about, which shows a very different picture. Here this Gemara in Eruvin Yud Gimel 13a. Tana Rabbanon. The sages said the following. Some of you will know this Gemara, but it is a pliya. It is an absolute, unbelievable piece of Talmudic, let's say, wisdom, which really requires our attention. Shtei shanim omechetze, 2.5 years, nichleku Beit Shammai o Beit Hillel. The houses of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, which I'm sure you all know about, had a differences of opinion. We know they have many different of opinions, rights to the Mishnah basically. But here's a very unusual one. Halalu omrim Noach lo le'adam shelo nifra yoter meshenifra. One school said it is better for man not to be born than to be born. That's one school. The halalu omrim Noach lo le'adam shenifra yoter meshelo nifra. And the other one says, no, it is much better for man to be born than not to be born. These are the difference of opinion between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. It's not even clear who says what, by the way. So what do? They have this discussion. Here it is. 2.5 years they are discussing, is it better to be born or it's better not to be born? I would have loved to be there to hear these discussions going on. Nimneu v'gamru. They took a vote, hear this, and they decided as follows. Noach lo le'adam shelo nifra yoter meshenifra. It is better for man not to have been born than to be born. However, there's a small problem, obviously. We are born. Achshav shenifra, and now that we are after all born, against our best wishes, it seems. Yefashfesh b'ma'asav, a man should look into his deeds, and also say Yemashmesh b'ma'asav, meaning to say basically, now that you're here in any way, if you like it or not, you better be careful how you behave yourselves. And then obviously comes the point that the way how to behave as Jews is to learn or to live in according to the laws of the Torah. This is an absolutely mind-boggling story. There's no continuation of this. This is all what is being told. There's a big problem about what exactly the word Noach lo le'adam means. I don't want to go into this now. But basically it means there's a difference of opinion between these two great schools about what is better. Now, I can tell you, I'm very involved in philosophy. I have never seen anywhere in a philosophical discussion that something like this is decided on by a majority vote. This is completely unheard of. Since when are you going to get philosophical truths by asking people, what do you think? Most people think the wrong things, get it wrong. So probably the minority knows much better than the majority. And here they deal with this in the same way as they deal with Kriyat Shema, with also matters which they discuss, which are purely halachic, but this is not a halachic discussion. This is a purely philosophical discussion. But they treat it as if it is an halachic issue, and the end conclusion is it is better not to be born. What are they discussing? Are they discussing suicide? Perhaps it is better to commit suicide? Don't know if you know, but there was a very famous French philosopher by the name of Albert Camus, whose famous statement was, there is only one serious philosophical problem in this world, and that is suicide. Should we or should we not commit suicide? That was his point of departure. And there is some truth in that. Why shouldn't we? Are they discussing this? This is what it is all about, and on the end they say, well, you can't really, and according to Jewish law, you're not allowed to commit suicide, so better make the best out of it. But, how many people are lucky enough not to be born? That's basically the question which was asked. Now, normally, if you ask the sages or the later commentators, so why? What's the point? So they say the reason why man has to be created is because afterwards, when he lives a proper life according to the Torah and according to ethical principles, then on the end he will have schar, he will have a reward in the world to come. And that's the whole point of why we are here. We are picking up as much reward as possible, and therefore that is the meaning why we should be living after all. I'll also say that because of all the ra which happens in the world, very problematic argument by the way, people grow and therefore they get better people, and if things would all be fine and well, then nobody would grow from anything because everything is fine already. After the Holocaust, this is a very difficult kind of argument to use, where people didn't have even a chance to be better people because they were killed in the most impossible ways. But this is what normally is being said, and obviously my answer to that is, it doesn't work, this argument. Not that there is nothing true to this, but you still have to ask yourself a question, and that is this. Why does man to get born has to get born so that he needs to get rewarded? What is the point in having this all together? Make him not to be born, so he doesn't get any reward. And I can tell you for sure nobody will miss it, that they are not rewarded because they were never there in the first place. So what is the point in saying that we need to be born so that we will be rewarded, when in fact it would be much easier if God would just not have got us born and everything would have been fine and under control. Nobody would have suffered, nobody would have any problems at all, everything would be fine just by not having any human beings around. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, since they are after all religious Jews, they are saying, listen, there is meaning to life. There is meaning to life. That's the reason why HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us. But what they seem to miss, and deliberately do so, is that they never discuss the question, what is that meaning? And here I come to a very important point. I always say to my students, the problem with the Torah is that it starts too late. The words, the first words, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, should have been at least the second pasuk and not the first one. Because there should have been one more pasuk, or perhaps a whole chapter before that, telling us the following. Why did God determine, why did he want a world and a universe to exist? Why do you want to have all this? And if you look in the Torah, there is absolutely no answer to that question. It is if the Torah jumps into the middle of something, starts by saying God created heaven and earth, and we are saying, wait a moment, why? What was the reason for that? Why does he need this world, the universe, with all the baby universes, with all the black holes, and all the also things which we know now about? We are in this little planet, so small compared to what is out over there. Why did he need that? What was the reason behind that? Silence. Not a word. There's nothing being said about it. It is as if the Torah is saying, I'm not prepared to give you that information. And that is a serious matter. Why does the universe need to exist? Why do these black holes and the baby universes need to exist? Why does man have to exist? My dear friends, even in secular philosophy, there is no answer to that question. That's not apologetics. These are the facts of life. You don't know why you exist. You can make up afterwards a nice interpretation. I exist for my wife, for my children, for making this community a better community, making other important contributions. Fine, well, great, beautiful. I can argue it is because I have to keep the mitzvot, or I have to be a shomer mitzvot. Fine, well, but it doesn't get to the essence of the main question. Why? Why does this all have to exist when, kaviyachol, as we say, speaking about God in human terms, God could have said, I'm not going to create everything at all. I just leave it for what it is, and you know why? It's much better. It's much better. I don't trouble anybody. There won't be any war. There won't be a Holocaust. There won't be earthquakes. There won't be anything at all. Why to do this? And we are looking in this Torah, and we are looking in this whole Jewish tradition, and we are looking in secular philosophy, and there is only one big answer: total silence. I can tell you for sure that there is no answer to this by the most atheistic philosophers. There is no answer by Spinoza, by Kant, by all the others, later and earlier great thinkers. And we are taken by total surprise that indeed we are being thrown into the middle of something, and we are being told, you better work this out. And if we ask the question, why? Then the answer is, keep your own business. It seems that God seems to say something, that's something between me and myself. But I can tell you something else he seems to say, and the Jewish tradition very much seems to emphasize this. And he's saying, you know, while you are here with all the problems, try to enjoy it as much as possible. And you know, the enjoyment is not in just going on vacation. In the enjoyment lies in the fact that you know that there is meaning to it. Meaning is there. What that meaning is, af echad lo yodea. Remember what I say. This is not apologetics. This is the facts of life, which even the most atheistic and secular philosopher can't do anything about. And there seems to be something else going on. The fact that we don't know what that meaning is seems to be understood to give it even more meaning and give it even more joy. I'm walking through all this. I don't know why. Very interesting, this place over here, this world over here. It's remarkable in every way. It is astonishing in every way. We should be able to live in total amazement every morning when we get out of our bed and we look to the sun going up and going under. And there is something to it, and we can't put our finger on it. I have great-grandchildren. Every time when I see a new one being born, and I see it a few hours, him or her, a few hours being born, I always say to all my children and my grandchildren, you know what I would like to do? To have a conversation with this baby and say to the baby, "Nu, what do you say? What do you think of this place?" And if the baby would be able to respond, the baby would say one thing: "Wow." I didn't expect anything like this. He would probably say at the beginning, "This is beautiful. Fantastic, there are two people looking after me. I look around, I see all the flowers, I see all the beautiful things." He doesn't yet know about any evil, any problems. Like all those young children, they still live in this beautiful messianic world. But when you grow up and you get older, you lose the wow. And because of that, you suddenly realize that this is much more complicated, but you're not getting an answer. Disturbing? Yes. Painful? Yes. Terrible? Yes. But at the same time, if we would take notice of what this world is all about, and it is extremely hard because you get used to everything, because we have this problem called a memory. You remember that yesterday the sun also came up and went under, and therefore you take it for granted for today. And I can tell you from a philosophical perspective, there is no way of proving that tomorrow morning the sun will go up. This was already stated by Bertrand Russell. It was stated by also very famous secular philosophers who said this whole concept of the laws of nature, where we rely on, tomorrow the whole thing can collapse and it probably doesn't even exist. It's just a repetition of constant miracles, which do the same thing over and over again, because we can't really explain the laws of nature. We use the laws of nature to explain things, but that is something completely different. Now, let me ask you one important question. I hope you get it. If I don't know why the world and the universe and I exist, how then can I decide whether or not evil needs to be part of this? If I don't even know the purpose of this place, how can I come and say, I believe that this place should not have any evil? My high, as they say in the Talmud. From where do you come to that conclusion? You can only make that statement the moment that you know why the world is there. And then you say, if the world is there, this concept called evil, this ra, this roa, doesn't belong there. It contradicts the plan of why the world is there. There's only one problem. Nobody knows anything about this plan. If God really exists, as we believe, then the only one who knows about it, what this plan probably means or is somebody who is not giving this information to us, probably because we won't be able to grasp it. But when we walk into the middle of the story and then we are asking the question which really requires that we need to know the beginning of the story, we run ourselves into a major paradox. That doesn't take anything away from the fact that Ra, that evil, is very hurtful and terribly painful, and we Jews know what we are speaking about over here. But from a purely objective point of view, thinking in normal terms, as long as we don't know the plan, we don't know if something needs to be included or needs to be excluded. This is a major problem for us, which we better dare to confront and understand and say, I do not know the purpose of all this. I do not know the plan. I do not know where anything of this needs to exist. And therefore, whether or not this needs to have something called Ra within itself, I can't answer. You know why? I lack the information. I just do not know. Now, my dear friends, I know very well that you have perhaps a hard time in what I'm saying over here, because we are not used to think like this. We're used to think from that we are the ones who can decide on that, and what we are actually doing is, when we are saying God needs to do this or needs to do that, and must make sure that Ra, that evil doesn't exist, then we are busy making God into somebody which we call an idol. Because we are going to say what is God needs or does not need to be or to think, or whatever name you want to give for this. And you know who got this right? Spinoza. The man who walked out on the Jewish tradition. Didn't want to hear about this Torah or anything like that, but was a genius man in Amsterdam, 17th century. I come from the same Portuguese Spanish synagogue as he comes from. But he walked out and I walked in. And he writes the following. Hear this, in a letter which he writes. I quote, I believe, that is Spinoza, I believe that if a triangle could speak, it would say in like manner that God is immanently a triangular. Human beings think about God in according to what they think God needs to be, which needs to be a God like we want him to be. While a circle would say that the divine nature is eminently circular. Thus each would ascribe to God its own attributes, would assume itself to be like God, and look on everything else as ill-shaped. You ask a triangle what God should be, and the answer is, he should be a triangle. And a circle should say, he needs to be a circle. Because that is what I want him to be, because that's the way how I think. I am the triangle. And Spinoza, who is far removed from a religious understanding of God, says, there lies our big problem whenever we discuss God. It doesn't work like that at all. And you know, we have a very good name for this. The moment we are going to project our ideas about what this world should be or what God needs to be, we have a fantastic Hebrew word for that. It is called avodah zarah. It is pure idol worship about God. God can be as much an idol as those are old idols of a few thousand years ago in the Far East and in the Middle East. And we are still, till this day, responsible, or better, guilty of doing that constantly. Making God into a human being and then deciding what he's allowed to do, what he's not allowed to do. While Spinoza tells us, you are busy here being like a little child, not understanding that it doesn't work at all like that. And I would have answered, or I would have added to Spinoza, you know why? And Spinoza would have no doubt agreed with that. We don't have the information of what this is all about. If you don't have information, how can you draw any conclusions? This is indeed an issue which relates to, as well, why there are earthquakes, why there are tsunamis, why children get born deformed, why all sorts of also things happen. When we are starting to look for answers, we're doing that via this brain over here, and that brain stays very limited in what it can grasp and what it can't grasp. And therefore we come to conclusions, or say, well, you see, religion or philosophy or even secular philosophy just doesn't want to deal with this. This is not at all true. It's not a matter of wanting to deal with it, it can't deal with it. The only thing what we can say is, God, why didn't you write a few psukim before Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz? Perhaps when we go upstairs after 120 years, whatever that means, we get an answer there. I'm not sure, but who knows? Here in this world, there is no answer to that particular problem. Where we may quite well make a mistake, and that is when we start to take this concept and we move it to the mitzvot of the Torah. Is ethics really the absolute and only foundation on which the morality of the mitzvot have to stand? Again, a very difficult question to ask. First of all, by the way, you should know, no time to go into this now, the whole issue of morality, or what is moral, is extremely complicated. If you read moral philosophers, and I'm speaking first about secular moral philosophers, you see they have enormous differences of opinion about what morality is. One of the biggest problems is that different moral systems clash. Righteousness clashes with tzedek, with justice. They don't go together. Anybody who is a judge will know and tell you how true this is. The judge sits in a room and he has to decide on a particular matter, and he is living in tension because on one side the law requires like this, justice requires this, but righteousness, mercifulness, Rachmanut for the particular situation is a completely different story, and they constantly clash. And what does the judge do? He tries to find a middle way. He buys a little bit of this and he buys a little bit of that, and there are different ways how to do this. I shall not go into this now, but this is the biggest problem. And the problem is also, in case that somebody would laugh to start saying, no, we should only go by justice, or we should only go by mercy, then the world will be a balagan gadol, because it would be impossible to live by only one system. But does the system clash? Oh yes, ask any judge and he will tell you it clashes left and right. And then that's not only with the judge and with the lawyer, but we'll find it in medical problems. We find it in all sorts of other situations where a doctor stands in front of something and he says, I could do like this, and I could justify it, and I could do it like this, and I can justify it. The only problem is that they completely clash. Very difficult then to decide. And by the way, you find it in halakha as well, and that has a lot to do with Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Because Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are both right. As the Gemara there says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. These and those are the words of the living God. Do they clash? Yes. The same way that light comes to us in this world, we know that light is basically made up out of all sorts of clashing colors, which come together and create for us the light which we have here. But it comes from a source which is full of paradoxes and great difficulties. That's life. Morality, therefore, is a highly problematic issue. And that happens, speaking in human terms, also to be true about God. How moral can God be? And what do we mean about a moral God? What is that? A God of justice? A God of mercy? A God of this or of that? Let me show you a very interesting observation made by the rabbis a long time ago. The rabbis have a very remarkable statement made about an issue which really goes to the core of all this. The Talmud says like this, or the Midrash says like this. This is a pasuk in Tehillim. Lechu ure'u mif'alot Elokim nora alila al bnei Adam. In Mizmor 66. Normally translated, come and see, lechu ure'u, the works of God. He is terrible, nora alila, he is terrible in his dealings with Bnei Adam, with man. Here's an accusation on God. Have a look what God does. It is an alila. It is a terrible thing what God does to man. Ask the Midrash, what do you mean? Comes the Midrash with, I would nearly say this is heresy of the first order, but the rabbi said it. And only the rabbis can say something like this. They basically attack God and they say, God, you know, the accusations which you constantly use against us are completely and totally unfair. They are alilot. For example, you decided that man needs to be mortal long before man was created. So the Midrash states it. But what do? You put this Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden, in the Gan Eden, and you make them to eat from the tree of knowledge, and then after you say to them, now you brought Mawet into this world. But we know quite well, God, that you had already decided on the Mawet, so what are you holding us responsible for? This is Nora Alila. Later on, not so long ago we read it in the Parashat Shavua. Joseph gets off to Egypt, and then afterwards we are asking the question, who is responsible for the terrible situation of the Jews in Egypt, in Mitzrayim? And then the answer is, well, that are the Achim of Yosef who put around this whole situation by which ultimately they got into Egypt. But says the Midrash, wait a moment, it doesn't work like that. God already had said a long time beforehand that they would go into such a place, and namely he was telling this to Avram Avinu, if not earlier than that. So what are you doing us? You are saying that the brothers are responsible? The answer is, you are responsible, God. You are just accusing us of things which we never did. And so on. And then here this is most remarkable. What do the rabbis do? They compare it to the following case. Hear this. It's brilliant and extremely disturbing. They come and they say, you know, it is like the case where a man sits outside and he decides to divorce his wife. So he writes a get. He puts the get into his pocket and he walks inside and he says to his wife, give me a cup of tea. She brings him a cup of tea. Then afterwards he says, the cup of tea is not hot enough. Here is your get. Exactly the Midrash. Here is your get. Says the woman to her, wait a moment, to him. You already wrote the get before I gave you the cup of tea. Right? Says the Talmud, that is exactly what God does with man. You already made up your mind that man needs to be mortal. You already made up the mind that the Jews have to live in Egypt for 400 years. And then you make us responsible, but you're going to get a long time beforehand. Says the Talmud, or better, says the Midrash, this, my dear friends, is God. In his greatness, in his incredible disturbance, in his annoying us, but that's what it is. And this is the sum total of life. Because on the end of the day, God is responsible for everything. For one good reason. He created this whole place. And if we afterwards do the wrong things because we have a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination, the answer is, you put that inclination into us. So who was really responsible here? Disturbing, but an absolute fact. Professor Yehuda Gelman, perhaps some of you have heard of him, professor of philosophy and Ben Gurion, good friend, deeply religious person, once said the following words about God, which is the best what can be said without being able to completely grasp it. He said the problem which we have with God is that indeed, besides what Spinoza says about us making God into a human being, basically, he says the following. Here this is very, very well done. I read him. Consider the relationship between a computer chip and a hard disk, the inside of it, on the one hand, and what you see on the screen of your computer. What do you see on the computer, on the screen? You see a picture. You take the computer chip, you take the hard disk, you take an enormous microscope or telescope, you put it on the disk because you want to see if this picture is found within the disk. Well, my friends, you can look and look and look, and there's nothing of that. There's absolutely nothing of that. And still we know that on the end of the day, the totsa'ah is that you get that picture on your computer, on your machshev. We know this because that's the way how it works. But we have not the slightest clue how it works. Nobody can explain you this. Because we don't understand the relationship between the disk and the chip, which hasn't got anything of this particular picture in itself, and on the end producing this picture on the screen. What you see, he writes, on the screen is the result of what is inscribed in the inside. Change the contents in the inside on the chip or on the hard disk, and you will see something different showing up on the screen. What is inscribed in the inside is nothing like what you get on the screen. Inscribed in the inside are no colors, no shapes of the pictures on the screen. You can peer into the inside through the most powerful microscope and you will see nothing of this at all. And still, yesh kesher. There is a relationship because one produces the other. Says Professor Gelman, that's the problem which we have with God. God is the disk. God is that particular computer chip. Everything is in there. And what comes out is what our world is all about. And we don't understand the relationship. And therefore certain things just go beyond us. And we are caught up into this paradox, which is there, as much as science tells us that it is there. There are also enormous paradoxes, no time to go into now, in science, which we cannot solve. They are the facts. Now what has this to do with the mitzvot in the Torah? Now hear well. First of all, be aware. And this is a piece of dangerous statement to make, but I have very good reasons to say so. I've written about this. We make the mistake that every disaster in this world is the result of us doing wrong things. This earthquake happened because we did this avira. This particular terrible child born deformed is because the parents did this. I am sure you have heard this in our religious community all the time. This is the way how it works. There are people walking around who seem to know exactly how God is thinking, and he will tell us this happened because of this reason, this happened because of that reason. By the way, including the Shoah, because we have rabbis who are also telling us exactly why the Shoah happened. This is the most un-Jewish idea ever to say. Why? Because if it is indeed true what we have said up till now, then we must admit that since we don't have the picture, it could quite well be that disasters and illnesses have got nothing to do at all with what we have done. They just happen because they are fundamental to the very existence of this universe, built in. And the man who understood this the best of all Jewish philosophers was Maimonides. The Rambam, most yeshiva people don't even understand this. The Rambam was far in front, in many ways, in philosophical thinking than any of the also Jewish philosophers at the time. He was an absolute genius. One of the points he makes is, for example, this. He says clearly, no time to go into this now, but it is all in the Guide for the Perplexed. You will see over there that the Rambam objects against this constant reminder, which we hear from others, that man is the center of the creation of the world and of the universe. Everything is there because of us. Maimonides says, nonsense. There's no such thing. We are no doubt playing a role here, but if I put it in terms of today, you're not going to tell me that the black holes have anything to do with the way how man lives over here. All the millions of stars and all the other baby universes, you're going to tell me that it's all created because of the few million people are walking around on this little place called the globe of the world? He says the truth about it is, le ma'anehu doesn't mean that God has created things for man, but this le ma'anehu means to have created it for himself. That is to say, that there are things within God, like the disk, like this particular non-existing screen, but this part of this computer article which makes it to happen the way as it is, and therefore things happen which has got nothing to do at all with what we do here in this world or why it was created. And who tells us that in very clear terms in Tanakh? Eov, Job. Because the whole story about Eov is exactly making that point. The man is saying correctly, I have not done anything wrong. And all his friends tell him, you must have done something wrong, otherwise this would not have happened to you. And he keeps on saying, I didn't. And then on the very end, he asked God the question, God, what is this all about? And God says to him, were you there when I created the world? When I was miyaseit ha'olam, the universe and everything at all? Who are you? And that is a most profound point to make. So what are the mitzvot? There are mitzvot there which we don't understand. The mamzer problem, the aguna problem, and now you must hear well. Perhaps they are the same as the earthquake, the same as an illness, the same created by God for reasons we don't know, because we are stepping in the middle of the story, and now we are, if we believe that the Torah is min hashamayim, we are having to live with that. But this is a fatal statement for me to make just like that. Because there is something else which is typically Jewish. Just as we are constantly busy with inventions to make the world a better place, tikkun ha'olam, but this time in overcoming all sorts of natural problems, making sure that this and that terrible problem doesn't happen anymore. And we are full of that in science. In the same way we have the obligation to do this concerning the mitzvot in the Torah, which are like earthquakes, which are like terrible incidents which happen, because the sages have the obligation to step in like the scientist steps into this world and tries to make this a better place and a more comfortable place. So the sages have to do exactly the same thing with the mitzvot. And therefore you get this strange thing, which at the beginning I couldn't grasp at all, when they come up and they argue the whole Mamzer problem away. Or take another very famous example, which I'm sure you all have heard about, the Ben Sorer or Moreh, the rebellious son, where the sages said, it lo haya v'lo yiyeh, it will never, it was never, it was not, it will never happen. It is only to challenge us and to learn some lessons from us. So the sages have said this about quite a few also things as well. Later on they applied this to Amalek. There's no Amalek anymore. And there are also things which they say they don't exist anymore. How did they dare to say this? Is this not rabbinical chutzpah of the first order? And the answer is yes. But that's exactly the duty which they have. We will find a way to argue this law away. Remember the famous story in the Mishnah already about mitat beitin, about death penalty? The sages just argued it away. Why did they do that? Because they knew that that is what the Torah ultimately wanted it to do, them to do. Here you have my world. Make it a better place. Here you have my Torah. Make it a better Torah. I'll give you one example. If you want to read about it, take what is lying outside and take it home and read it carefully. The Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed, for example, says, you all know this, Avdut, the concept of slavery, really doesn't belong in the Torah at all. How did it get into the Torah? Says Maimonides, there's a tremendous difference of opinion about this between him and the Ramban and others. Says Maimonides, I tell you why. The reason is that we took this over from the non-Jewish world at the time, who was still involved in all these sort of things. They had korbanot, they had slavery, they had all sort of things which really don't belong at all in the Torah. But since man can't change this just overnight, he says, therefore the Torah for the meantime allows it, till slowly but surely it is moved out altogether and it disappears. Which happened with slavery, and which happened with Avodah Zarah, with idol worship. You know what this means, my friends? It means that what there sometimes is in the Torah, which was given at Sinai a few thousand years ago, doesn't belong there. And let me say something very crucial now. If God would have given the Torah a few hundred years later, the laws concerning slavery and the laws concerning Avodah Zarah, or better sacrifices, at least according to Maimonides, would not have been part of that text. Because, as Maimonides, and also disagree with him, Maimonides says the Torah was given at a certain moment in Jewish history when it was still necessary to have these particular laws. But if it would have been a few hundred years later or a few thousand years later, the Torah would have looked totally different. Sure, I understand why the Ramban and others don't want to have any part in this. But it is Maimonides who says this. And I think there is a lot of truth in this. That doesn't mean to say that the Torah which was given to Moses is not Mei Sinai and not Mina Shamayim, but it is Mina Shamayim inside the history of the Jewish people at that very moment. Because then there was still a need for these mitzvot. But later on, some of these mitzvot need to disappear. This is the point Maimonides is making. By the way, he's not making it about slavery, he's only making it about the korbanot. But it's the same principle. There's much more to be said about this. So what is happening over here? Why are the sages constantly finding ways, far-fetched, to show that the child is not a mamzer? Or that the child is not, or the woman is not really married, and therefore she is able to marry somebody else. I'll tell you a remarkable story which I heard. I won't say exactly the names of all the people involved, but it's a typical example. There was in Holland many, many years ago a woman who came from Eastern Europe and came to live in Amsterdam, a religious woman. And she told the Rabbanut at the time that her husband had died in the Shoah. There was evidence for that, and she asked if she could get remarried again. And the rabbi said, sure, if there's proof that your husband has died and you have evidence for that, then you can marry. She remarries, gets 2 children, and there comes the first husband. There was a mix-up. This has happened quite a few times, by the way, in Jewish history. There was a mix-up, and the husband was still alive. And straight away the question was, what about the children? The mamzerim. Because she was still married to the first husband. And that's indeed what the Rabbanut at the time in Holland said, they're mamzerim. There was one lady who said to the Rabbanut, do you, and this is a long, long time ago, do you allow me to take this to Rav Unterman, who was the chief rabbi here at the time? I want to put this in front of him. And I tell you the story how I heard it. I heard different nuschaot of this story. But the basics are true. She came to Rav Unterman, who was an incredible great person. And he said to her, when you got married with your first husband, how did you get married? She said, I got married, a chupan kiddushin, like all religious people do, all Jews do. He says, I understand, but tell me something. Did your husband have any money? She says, no, he was terribly poor. This was just before the Holocaust. We didn't have a penny. So he says to her, so from where did the ring come? By which he married you. So she said, well, he gave me the ring. And Rav Unterman said, that ring could not have been of his. So you were never married, and your children are not mamzerim. This is gatlut of the first order. But it is typically the way how the halacha works. Now you may argue, how does he know for sure? The story continues and says that the woman said, but wait a moment, I have more to tell. And Rav Unterman says, Ani lo rotze lishmoa shum davar yoter. This Rabotai shows tremendous chokhmah and insight. I, as Rav Unterman, have the right to pasken the sheila. Halacha is not in heaven. Torah lo bashamayim here, it was given in our hands. We decide, not God. And that's what he did. And there are loads of stories like that, my dear friends. That is the tikkun. So if I would like to say this a little different, I would say like this. The halacha is a damage control on the mitzvot. Damage control on the mitzvot. What it does is, the halacha, officially the mitzvot are like this, and the halacha and the concept of Torah lo bashamayim walks in and said, wait a moment. It's not so easy, it's not straightforward. We are not reading the Bible here, we are reading the Torah. That's a completely different story. And in that story you have to realize that we have the power to do unbelievable things. That's all our responsibility. I'm publishing a book in a few months, which I just gave in to the publishers, where I make the point that one of the biggest problems today in our society, and I say this with all respect, is that we don't have halachic courage anymore, like Rav Unterman had, like also great people had, and that is creating a lot of problems where there is no need for these problems. It's very complicated, I won't go into any details now, but no doubt that is part of the problems which we have here in the state of Israel, where we can solve many of them if we would have the courage to do so. And therefore my end conclusion is, and here I have to stop, so I'll allow you for a few questions, and that is this. Is God good? That's a meaningless question. It's a completely meaningless question. Because what we mean by the word good may first of all exist out of loads of contradictions in terms, which they really do, including secular philosophy. All what we can say is that God requires us, God does good, but he will only do good until the point that he does not interfere with the plan of why he decided to create this universe, of which we do not have any information whatsoever. So it seems that at the moment when there is a clash between God's goodness and on the other side God's plan for this world, which we do not know, then one of them gives in. And so it is true about the mitzvot as well. It is all a matter of damage control, I would nearly say, divine damage control on God himself, done by God. There's a very famous midrash which comes to my mind while I'm speaking about the mamzer. The midrash tells the mamzer comes to, or better, God says to the mamzer, one day I will purify you. And who are the ones who told you that you're a mamzerim? You know who that Chevra was? The Sanhedrin. They decided that you are a mamzerim. But I am here to come and relieve you of all this and to make sure to liberate you of all this. And then you say to yourself, hey, wait a moment. Who instituted the institution of the mamzer? God himself. And now God comes and says, you know, and I'm going to liberate it because I don't agree with this law. This is typical Jewish. This is typical of the Jewish God. You can say a lot about this and there's no time for it. But this is what it is. And therefore the question about God being good is a meaningless statement like Maimonides, like Spinoza said. And it is also meaningless to ask the question about the mitzvot. What we can say is this: God at a certain moment decided for the mamzer, so that it seems that afterwards we will find every way out. And God says to us, you know what? We are creating together the Torah. I gave you the text, and I gave you the rules of interpretation, and now you work on it. And let's prove yourself that you undo my mitzvot if there's a need for it. There are rules for that, no doubt, as the Talmud very clearly says, but there are rules for that. And God says on the end, you know, this very famous story when the rabbis tell us that they were sitting around the table and they're discussing a particular problem, and at a certain moment one rabbi says it is like this, and all the other rabbis say it is like that. And then the one rabbi wants to prove his point, and he says, you know, I can prove that I'm right, because if this particular tree standing over there is going to walk a few meters, then it is a proof that I'm right, and the tree starts to walk. And the rabbis say, doesn't prove anything at all. He says, well, let's take the Amat Hamayim, that is to say the river which comes down from the mountain. If it runs upstairs, then it means to say that I'm right, and it starts straightway to run upstairs, and the rabbis say, what do you want from us? And on the end he says, if I'm right, let God so say himself. And a bat call comes, and heavenly voice comes, famous story, unbelievable story, and says, what do you have against, I think it was Rabbi Eliezer, the halacha is always like him, and the other rabbi gets up and says, God, this has absolutely nothing to do with you. We decide this matter. You know why? Because you wrote in the Torah that the Torah is no longer Bashamayim. You gave it into our hands, and we are the ones to decide. And then comes this beautiful story afterwards, that one of the rabbis goes up, Rabbi Nathan goes up to Eliyahu Hanavi, and he asked Eliyahu Hanavi, what did God say when he heard that he was defeated in the argument? And God says, was laughing, smiling, so the Talmud says, and he says, my children have defeated me, my children have defeated me. I lost the argument, and look in the Rambam and you will see that the psak is against God. That is Jewish tradition till its very peak, to its very essence of what this is all about. And therefore asking the question about the mitzvot, whether or not they are moral, or whether God is moral, yes or no, I'm not saying that there are not questions which we need to discuss, but we have to know on the end of the day that the story is very different. God is good to a point. The mitzvot are good to a point. And we are there to say to God, you better make sure that this and this happens over there. And at the same time, God says to us, wait a moment, I have a plan, and that plan will have to come about. Could you perhaps give us information about it? Have a look in the Torah. I kept silent about that, and you will have to live with it. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. Thank you very much. Few questions before I have to go. Bavakasha. You can speak in Hebrew also, if that's easier. Otot davar.
I'll ask the first question. Thank you very much. You you explain quite forcefully that the question of why is not answered or answerable perhaps because those psukim were not written. The Torah started after that answer was given, so we cannot know the answer to that question, why. Now my question about the question, I hope it's not Tirah, is the idea that there's an answer to that question knowledge or faith? In other words, how do you know there's an answer to the question? Maybe we don't know because there's no answer.
It's very possible. But that's part of the problem. The problem is that I do not know who God is, what God is. I'm speaking about God without having any understanding of Him. I only know that He exists, and the word existence is highly problematic. Therefore, both are true. There is an answer and there's no answer. In the same way that God is an it and him or a her, He is a being, is not a being. I think it was Saul Lieberman, the great scholar in the JTS, in the Jewish Theological Seminary. He writes in one beautiful article of his, he says, the most tragic figure in this world is God. Because we can't make any sense out of it. But there's only one point which needs to be made. To say that therefore God does not exist is making only more problems and not less problems. That's not an answer, that's an escape. It's much easier to say that God does not exist. The question is, Rav Soloveitchik writes about this, the question is, how do you live with this terrible, difficult God? So, yes, no, it's all the same.
You said that your father was a Spinozist. Now, I never heard of anyone being that. Does that mean he studied it, or is there some kind of a group of people that still hold today by Spinoza?
Spinoza is a very interesting philosophy written in the Ethics and the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, as it is called. It's written in Latin originally, which is a whole way of looking to this world, to human midot, to characteristics, to God, to religion and so on, which is in many ways far removed from the Jewish tradition and in other ways very close to the Jewish tradition. And there are people who live in according to this particular theory, and my father was one of them. I was grown up on the Bergaim of Spinoza. If there was any discussion at home about anything important, then there was only one rabbi in our home, and that was Baruch Spinoza.
The question over here.
Yes.
Hi. When you were explaining how you were saying with the case from the lady who ended up being that her kids were in Sarah, why are you so sure that this idea that Torah, Hashem gave us Torah, so it's no longer in Hashemayim and now it's in our hands? Like, how couldn't we say that now it's in our hands and we have the ability to make like Psak Halacha, like the chief rabbi did? Like, even Halacha today goes against that by saying like there's things that we don't do because back in the day we weren't allowed.
Well, basically, it's the pasuk in the Torah itself, and it says that we have always to go in according to the majority vote. That's a pasuk in Shemot, where God says, whenever you have difference of opinion, you have a majority vote, and a majority will decide. That's Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, and all of them. So this is a very big principle within the Jewish tradition, which is only known in the Jewish tradition, that God basically gives the job over to human beings and says to human beings, I did my part, I gave you all the stuff which are the ingredients of the Torah, now you better start to work on it and work it out in a way that you see fit, and I will then agree with you whatever you come up with. That's the most remarkable thing. It is compared by another midrash, like a king comes to two of his servants, and each one he gives them a little bit of gives them water and grain or something flask, and he says, I'm going on a trip. In a year time I will be back. Show me what you will be doing. So one leaves the flask and the water lying around, and it gets rotten, and the other one takes it, makes a beautiful bucket out of it, a beautiful garment out of it, or a beautiful piece of bread. A year later the king comes back and says, show me what you have done with my stuff. And the other one says, it's all rotten. And he also once says, here, I made a beautiful bucket, a beautiful garment out of it. Says the king, that's what I gave you it for. I gave you the ingredients, you work with that, you develop it, you make something very beautiful out of it. That's what God says to the Jews concerning the Torah. I gave you the Torah in the form of flask and grain. You work on it till you make something nice out of it. This is a typical Jewish way of looking to things.
What if we don't do the right thing with it? What if we don't make a beautiful flask and we do something else?
Then we are in trouble. Then we haven't done that what the king has asked us to do. That's exactly the point.
Even if it's a majority?
Even when a majority would indeed not do, there's a whole discussion in the Talmud about it. If the majority makes a mistake, what happens then? Long story, no time to go into this now, but it's discussed in great length in the Talmud, that at a certain moment, if nothing comes out of this on the very end, then it means that the majority has made a mistake. But this is, you should know, this is so important to know. There is nothing in another religion like this. You won't find this in Christianity, you won't find it in Islam. I know what I'm speaking about. You won't even find it in secular philosophy. This is typically Jewish. We basically are saying God gave it into our hands, and we're even saying to him in that case, it is now our business and not your business. This is goed spa of the first order, but it is fantastic.
May I make a compliment that I think we have two of the more courageous Rabbonim in this room, and you talked about the courage of Rabbonim is important. You also talk about the historical aspect of halacha, and within the Masorti tradition, there are certain Masorti halachic philosophers who actually taken the stuff, halacha must have an historical aspect to it. Do you define yourself as an Orthodox Rav or Masorti?
I knew it was coming. I give you my real answer. I'm an Orthodox rabbi. But I believe, and hear what I say, the conservative movement is getting more and more closer to orthodoxy, and orthodoxy is getting more closer to the conservative movement. It is changing, clearly so. I predict within the next 50 years they will be one and the same. I dare to say this because you already see the developments taking place on both sides. I read that stuff left and right all the time. And you see that they're growing together because certain things the conservative movement is now taking from the Orthodox world. But it's very clear that the Orthodoxy realizes that there are many things within the conservative movement, especially the historical side to the development of the halacha, which is clear as can be when you look in the Talmud and in the later commentaries, right? You can't just put this aside and say there is nothing there. And there are more and more, especially young Israeli rabbis today who are saying this. So I predict in 50 years' time, this probably will be one and the same. At least modern orthodoxy together with the conservative world. I can't speak about the Haredi. I don't know what happens there. I learned my whole life in yeshivot, which were Harediot. But I think they're behind somewhere. Also, they have beautiful also things there, which I would never want to leave at any time. But I don't know what will happen with the reform movement, or it will collapse, or it will become also more and more traditional, and that is also already happening today here also in this country. We are going to see within the next 50 years, I put my hand in fire for this, a complete change of situation of what Yahadut is going to be, which will take over Israeli society, where many more people will fall in love with Yahadut, also the people in Ramat Aviv and the people in Tel Aviv. It is already happening, I'm part of it, and you will see much more will take place, but it needs broad thinking. And that broad thinking is not yet in the official establishment. It will come. So for the meantime, I'm Orthodox. There was a lady over there who wanted to ask a question.
Actually that was
that
my
was your
question too, so.
Bakasha.
So when you
speak about the rabbis making the decision to change something that's not good. So, but they're changing it from some moral perspective. What do they decide the morality is? So what, it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. Like, what are they basing their new way of looking at morality?
Very, very good
from the outside
question.
world, or from their own
Yes,
inner
yes.
world?
Very good question, and the answer is that it depends on each rabbi. It is not something that has been established, and it is Baruch Hashem that it was never established. Every rabbi walks in with his own moral ideas and feelings and emotions, with his own hashkafa, which, by the way, you can clearly see when you see the enormous differences between Sephardic poskim and Ashkenazi poskim, which is enormous. If you take somebody like Rav Uziel, the first chief rabbi, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, who is today nearly not quoted anymore, but if you read there how the man brings constant moral ideas into his halachic discussion, you are absolutely overtaken by the beauty of it. And this happens in a different way, has happened, and perhaps is happening in the, what I call the post-Hasidic movement, which is at this moment also moving forward. And you will, again, it depends very often, I could clearly prove you that a rabbi or a posek has a she'elah in front of him, and he knows what he wants it to be an answer. He already has made up his mind even before he has looked in any sources. And what does he do afterwards? And that is perfectly okay. He then uses all the Talmudic arguments to get to where he wants to be.
But what's the
And
source
then,
of
and the
it?
source of that is his heart.
Yeah, it's personal.
Is his heart, and there are differences of opinion about what the heart tells you. The Seder Gamor, ein shum baya baze. This is the beauty. There is no such thing as objective halacha. There's no such thing that I put a she'elah in a computer and I get it out. If you look into the She'elot of the Shuvot of Reb Moshe Feinstein, you constantly see that this man was moved by a deep moral commitment, which he used in ways, I can tell you stories about it, unbelievable, where he did for Agunot things which nearly nobody dared to do, and it was clearly his heart who made him to do this, and he found a Talmudic way to justify it. And this is a very, very beautiful, and we should be extremely proud about this. Thank you very much.